I'm Major General Ulysses S. Grant, and Vicksburg has fallen. Vicksburg has surrendered. Much happened in just 24 hours between 10 o'clock in the morning on July the 3rd and 10 o'clock on July the 4th of 1863. And I should like to review with you and talk about some of those instances. I was working here in my tent on the morning of July 3rd, about 10 a.m., and an aide came in and gave me a message. He said, there's a General John Bowen out here under flag of truce from General Pemberton, and he says that General Pemberton wants to meet with you, and gave me a message, and General Bowen would like to see you. I declined. I told the aide, tell General Bowen that I will not see him, but I read this note, and which I will share with you, and told him, tell General Bowen that I will meet General Pemberton at 3 p.m. this afternoon between the lines, at our lines nearest each other, which was in front of McPherson's lines. But the message that General Pemberton had sent me was, Major General U.S. Grant, commanding United States forces, I have the honor to propose to you an armistice for several hours with a view to arranging terms for the capitulation of Vicksburg. That was certainly good news. To this end, if agreeable to you, I will appoint 3 commissioners to meet a like number to be named by yourself at such place and hour today as you may find convenient. I thought, at such place and hour today as you may find convenient. I make this proposition to save the further effusion of blood, which must otherwise be shed to a frightful extent, feeling myself fully able to maintain my position for a yet indefinite period. This communication will be handed you under the flag of truce by Major General J.S. Bowen. It was no accident that Bowen was sent out to meet me, because John Bowen and I were good friends. We'd been neighbors, in fact, in St. Louis during my lean times before the war, when I was trying to farm and sell wood. So Pemberton's choice of Bowen was a shrewd one. He felt that I would meet with a friend. Well, I was not going to meet with anyone not commensurate in rank with me, particularly on an impromptu movement. But I did tell General Bowen that I would meet him this afternoon. In fact, my reply was, Lieutenant General J.C. Pemberton, commanding Confederate forces, etc., your note of this date is just received, proposing an armistice for several hours for the purpose of arranging terms of capitulation through commissioners to be appointed, etc. The useless effusion of blood you propose stopping by this course can be ended at any time you choose by an unconditional surrender of the city and the garrison. Men who have shown so much endurance and courage as those now in Vicksburg will always challenge the respect of an adversary, and I can assure you will be treated with all the respect due to prisoners of war. I do not favor the proposition of appointing commissioners to arrange terms of capitulation, because I have no other terms than those indicated above. I am General respectfully, etc., U.S. Grant. But I did verbally tell my aide to tell Bowen that I would meet with Pemberton that afternoon, which would indicate a little flex. Maybe I wasn't pushing for unconditional surrender. And the aide had told me that General Bowen had told him to tell me that General Pemberton really wanted to meet with me, which piqued my interest. Really wanted to meet with me, eh? All right, well then I'll meet with him. So I went out that afternoon and met at what is now known as the Surrender Knoll under a large oak tree. I rode up. I had, as I recall, E.O.C. Ord, James McPherson, John Logan, and Smith, A.J. Smith, and quite an entourage for me. Pemberton came out with a lieutenant colonel, I recall, I think Montgomery, and John Bowen. It also should be noted that Bowen was out of a sick bed during all of this. He was suffering from dysentery. In fact, Bowen died of it not long after the surrender. So Bowen was actually in his last days. But I have great respect for him that he got out of a sick bed, particularly from dysentery, and rode his horse out to meet with me and with Pemberton. Pemberton dismounted. I dismounted. We met. Pemberton said, "Well, what are your terms?" And I said, "Well, General, there are no terms except unconditional surrender." And Pemberton became quite miffed. He said, "Well, many of your men are going to die before this is over if all you have is unconditional surrender," and started to turn and walk away. And I said, "Very well." I walked back to my horse, had a foot in the stirrup, but John Bowen and McPherson intervened at this point and said, "Let us meet and try to work this out. We'll come up with something acceptable." And I said, "That's quite all right with me," because I knew that I wouldn't be bound by any kind of an agreement that they should make. And perhaps it would ease the tension, which I think to an extent that it did. So Pemberton and I sat, I think, on a log, as I recall, past the time of day for a while. And then Bowen and McPherson came back to me and A.J. Smith and said, "What we want to do is we'll march in and stack our colors, and then we'll march out and leave with weapons." And I said, "Well, that's not acceptable. We can't do that." And again, Pemberton is a little perturbed, and I was more than a little irked. But I said, and Pemberton had told me, "Well, I understand you wanted to meet with me." And I said, "I understand you wanted to meet with me." And we both looked at John Bowen, who's telling each that the other wanted to meet with him because he was so sincere about us getting together. But I said, "General, I'll reconsider this matter, and I'll send you a message by 10 o'clock this night." So Pemberton retired to within his lines. I then held essentially the only council of war that I ever held, and I'll never hold another one. And I had every officer present, junior to senior, give his opinion. And they all wanted to attack an unconditional surrender. I wanted to parole them. I'd already talked to Porter, Admiral Porter, and he told me if they surrender 30,000 men, it's going to take me weeks, if not months, to get them to the northern Aiken's Landing on the James River, which was according to the Dix Hill Agreement, the exchange point or parole point for Confederate prisoners and or federal prisoners. And Vicksburg was the exchange point for Confederate prisoners, and Colonel Watts, the Confederate exchange agent, was indeed in Vicksburg. So rather than take all of that time going to garrison duty while Porter took 30,000 men up north, and once they got there had to bring them back because there weren't as many federal prisoners as 30,000 Confederate. So they couldn't be exchanged, they'd have to be paroled. Then they've got to get back to their several homes across the South. And I thought, this is unacceptable. We'll parole them here. I won't be locked here in a garrison duty while they're sent up north. They're not going to go up north and come back down here paroled. We'll just cut to the meat of the matter and parole them here. My officers wanted to attack, and I resolved never again to hold a council of war because it's just a waste of time, and I know what I want to do anyway. I don't have to have them tell me what to do, and it made, I think, everybody angry. Just a waste of time and makes your staff angry. So I sent this note in reply that evening to General Pemberton. My 10 o'clock note that I said I would send. In conformity with the agreement of this afternoon, I will submit the following proposition for the surrender of Vicksburg, public stores, etc. On your accepting the terms proposed, I will march in one division as a guard and take possession at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Now remember, this is 10 o'clock after 10 o'clock on the night of July 3rd. As soon as rolls can be made out and paroles be signed by officers and men, you will be allowed to march out of our lines, the officers taking with them their sidearms and clothing, and the field staff and cavalry officers 1 horse each. The rank and file will be allowed all their clothing, but no other property, just their clothing. If these conditions are accepted, any amount of rations you may deem necessary can be taken from the stores you now have, and also the necessary cooking utensils for preparing them. He had been blustery with me about we can hold out indefinitely. We have plenty of food. And I thought, well, if you've got so much food, then you take your own rations with you when you march out after the surrender, and even bring your own cooking utensils, because we're not going to prepare your food for you. I went on to say 30 wagons also, counting 2 two-horse mule teams as one, will be allowed to transport such articles as cannot be carried along. The same conditions will be allowed to all sick and wounded officers and soldiers as fast as they become able to travel. The paroles for these latter must be signed, however, whilst officers present are authorized to sign the roll of prisoners. I am very respectfully, etc., and so forth. So I sent that note to Pemberton after 10 p.m. on the night of the 3rd. Pemberton apparently palavers with his staff and talks a bit, sends me back this reply. This is into the 4th of July, in the wee hours of the morning. General, I have the honor to acknowledge the receipt of your communication of this date proposing terms of capitulation for this garrison and post. In the main, your terms are accepted, but in justice both to the honor and spirit of my troops manifested in the defense of Vicksburg, I have to submit the following amendments, which, if acceded to by you, will perfect the agreement between us. At 10 a.m. tomorrow, I propose to evacuate the works in and around Vicksburg and to surrender the city and garrison under my command. By marching out with my colors and my arms, stacking them in front of my present lines, after which you will take possession. Officers to retain their sidearms and personal property, and the rights and property of citizens to be respected. I am very respectfully, etc., J.M. Pemberton. Well, this didn't sit well with me, because I knew what personal property for those officers meant: slaves. So I replied, again, this is into the wee hours of the morning on the 4th of July, and said to General Pemberton this: I have the honor to acknowledge the receipt of your communication of July 3rd. The amendment proposed by you cannot be acceded to in full. It will be necessary to furnish every officer and man with a parole signed by himself, which, with the completion of the rolls of prisoners, will necessarily take some time. I knew he had 30,000 troops. Again, I can make no stipulations with regard to the treatment of citizens and their private property. While I do not propose to cause them any undue annoyance or loss, I cannot consent to leave myself under any restraint by stipulations. The property which officers will be allowed to take with them will be as stated in my proposition of last evening. That is, officers will be allowed to take their private baggage and sidearms, and mounted officers 1 horse each. If you mean by your proposition for each brigade to march to the front of the lines now occupied by it and stack arms at 10 a.m. and then return to the inside and there remain as prisoners until properly paroled, I will make no objection to it. Should no notification be received as your acceptance of my terms by 9 a.m., I shall regard them as having been rejected and shall act accordingly. Should these terms be accepted, white flags should be displayed all along your lines to prevent such of my troops as may not have been notified from firing upon your men. I am, General, very respectfully, your obedient servant, U.S. Grant. Now, I had also, upon the initiation of these talks, gone out and met with Admiral Porter on his ship, the new ship, the Black Hawk. His other command ship had been destroyed, and told him that we were negotiating and to cease fire on the city. And they'd fired some 20,000 rounds into the city from all of his Navy in the river. And told him my staff is wanting to attack, I'm wanting to take paroles and so forth. And he said, well, he'd cease fire and wait until he heard further from me. So this is what I sent to General Pemberton. And 9 o'clock came and went and no flags. I was fully prepared to go back into the siege mode, knowing that we were going to attack on the 6th. I had also told my officers and staff, pass the word along the line for our troops to talk to their troops and say, hey, we're wanting to parole you and send all you fellows home. That's what we're going to do if we can. If your general will surrender you, no more fighting, no more killing. The old man, Grant, wants to send all of you home. I thought that might take some of the fight out of them. I did get the message that morning from Pemberton that says, General, I have the honor to acknowledge the receipt of your communication this day and in reply to say that the terms proposed by you are accepted. So they marched out, stacked their arms, and in some cases they were only 15 or 20 feet away where they stacked their arms from our lines that had gotten that close. Some of these men could actually, I believe, have clubbed the enemy with their musket if they'd reached out just a bit. So they marched out, stacked arms and their flags, and went back into the lines as prisoners waiting to be paroled, which I was going to start immediately. And then at 10:30 that morning on the 4th, I sent to General Halleck this telegram, the enemy surrendered this morning. The only terms allowed is their parole as prisoners of war. This I regarded as of great advantage to us at this juncture. It saves probably several days in the capture term, leaves troops and transports ready for immediate service. General Sherman with a large force will face immediately on Johnston and drive him from the state. I will send troops to the relief of General Banks and return the 9th Corps to General Burnside. Now, Burnside's up in the Eastern Theater. Banks is down trying 100 or more miles south of us, trying to take the last fortress on the Mississippi River, Port Hudson. And so I was going to send troops down there to Banks. And then David Porter sent me this message. General Grant, I congratulate you in getting Vicksburg on any honorable terms. He knew I was disgruntled about that staff meeting. You would find it a troublesome job to transport so many men, and I think that you will be left so free to act, it will counterbalance any little concession you may seem to make to the garrison. So he's trying to add salve to the bruises there about a staff meeting, and they want one thing, and I know I'm going to do another. Now, a note of interest from McPherson about slaves, because I assumed that by Pemberton saying the officers would take their personal property, that he meant some of them would take their manservants that they had with them. And President Lincoln has issued the Emancipation Proclamation now 6 months ago. And everywhere we go, and occupy or take land, the slaves are free. So there were no slaves, and there were going to be no slaves in Vicksburg, Mississippi, or its environs. Now, that's why I was so careful. They can take their baggage and their sidearms and a horse. But the next day, on July 5th, James McPherson sent me this. No enlistments of the Negro, or had asked me rather about, what about enlisting Negroes to fight for us? And which was the opposite of officers, Confederate officers trying to take body servants with them. So I sent this message to McPherson. No enlistments of the Negroes captured in Vicksburg will be allowed for the present. All the male Negroes we want collected and organized into working parties for the purpose of policing the grounds around the city, unloading steamers, and fitting up the fortifications for our use. In regard to rebel officers taking their servants with them, that is one of the conditions I expressly refused them. After the city was surrendered, however, one of the officers on General Pemberton's staff asked me what I was going to do about servants who were anxious to accompany their masters, remarking that many of them had been raised with their servants and it was like severing families to part them. I remarked that no compulsory measures would be used to hold Negroes. I want the Negroes all to understand that they are free men. If they are then anxious to go with their masters, I do not see the necessity of preventing it. Some going might benefit our cause by spreading disaffection among the Negroes at a distance by telling that the Yankees set them all free. It is not necessary that you should give yourself any trouble about Negroes being enticed away from officers. Everyone who loses a Negro will insist that he's been enticed off because otherwise his Negro would not leave. As I said before, it was positively refused that the privilege of carrying off private servants should be granted. Because I said afterwards coercion would not be used to retain servants, it is no reason that the strength of the garrison should be used in preserving a neutrality between our men and Negroes that would enable the Confederate officers to carry off their Negroes by force. And that ended that matter. On July the 7th, General Halleck sent me this message. Major General Grant, near Vicksburg, Mississippi. It gives me great pleasure to inform you that you have been appointed to Major General in the regular Army, to rank from July 4th, the date of your capture of Vicksburg. So now I have higher salary, I've got a pension, I've gone from volunteer to regular professional Army, which is where I have wanted to be all the time. I made a note to send to General Halleck the message that they'd surrendered. I sent Captain William Dunn to Cairo, the nearest point where a telegraph could be reached, with a dispatch as follows, and that was when I described to him that I was going to send troops to Banks and return Burnside's Ninth Corps to Burnside. And I wrote this observation. As soon as our troops took possession of the city, guards were established along the whole line of parapet, from the river above to the river below. The prisoners were allowed to occupy their old camps behind the entrenchments. No restraint was put upon them except by their own commanders. They were rationed about as our own men and from our supplies. The men of the two armies fraternized as if they had been fighting for the same cause. When they passed out of the works they had so long and so gallantly defended between the lines of their late antagonists, not a cheer went up. Not a remark was made that would give pain. Really, I believe there was a feeling of sadness just then in the breasts of most of the Union soldiers at seeing the dejection of their late antagonists. And on the 11th of July, I issued this order as they were going to leave Vicksburg to get on the cars and go back to Jackson for paroling. Paroled prisoners will be sent out of here tomorrow. They will be authorized to cross the railroad bridge and move from there to Edwards Ferry or Edwards Station, and on by way of Raymond. Instruct the commands to be orderly and quiet as these prisoners pass, to make no offensive remarks, and not to harbor any who fall out of rank after they have passed, meaning the ones that don't want to be paroled. They want to be prisoners of war, and be sure they're out of the war. And there were several hundred that wanted that. The first dispatch that I received from the government regarding the surrender of Vicksburg was on July the 8th, and it was from General Halleck in response to my telegram that they had surrendered. And he said, "I fear your paroling the prisoners at Vicksburg without actual delivery to a proper agent as required by the 7th article of the cartel may be construed into an absolute release, and that the men will immediately be placed in the ranks of the enemy. Such has been the case elsewhere. If these prisoners have not been allowed to depart, you will detain them until further orders." But General Halleck was not aware that they had already been delivered into the hands of Major Watts, Confederate Commissioner for the Exchange of Prisoners. And one other item that I should like to review with you is the letter I got from President Lincoln on July the 13th, when he said, "My dear General, I do not remember that you and I have ever met personally. I write this now as a grateful acknowledgement for the almost inestimable service you have done for the country. I wish to say a word further. When you first reached the vicinity of Vicksburg, I thought you should do what you finally did: march the troops across the neck, run the batteries with the transports, and thus go below." And I never meant to Port Hudson and General Banks. "And I never had any faith, except a general hope that you knew better than I, that the Yazoo Pass expedition and the like could succeed. When you got below and took Port Gibson, Grand Gulf, and vicinity, I thought you should go down the river and join General Banks. And when you turned northward east of the Big Black, I feared it was a mistake. Now I wish to make the personal acknowledgement that you were right and I was wrong. Yours very truly, A. Lincoln." And that would, I think, for the moment, end the matter of my review with you about the surrender of Vicksburg and all that transpired within just 24 hours, from 10 a.m. on the morning of July 3rd to 10 a.m. on the morning of July 4th. Much happened, much that was fraught with import. But we took Vicksburg, we marched into Vicksburg and occupied the city, and except for Port Hudson, which fell just on July 9th, just a few days later, the Mississippi, when Port Hudson fell, was truly open all the way to the Gulf. And as President Lincoln said, "The Father of Waters flows unvexed to the sea." And I was promoted to Major General, regular Army, professional Army. I was pleased. I must bring my remarks to an end at this time and be about my business. I suggest you be about yours until we meet again. I'm Major General, Regular Army, Ulysses S. Grant, bidding you adieu.